Thank you. Okay, we're. Thank you all. I was asked to talk about myself actually, which I don't particularly like, but I think today Slush is a very interesting example of bridges that we can build between Europe and Asia. And actually, what I would like to talk about today is building bridges between Europe and Asia. So actually, just to tell you about myself, I was born in Korea in the 70s. I was adopted by a French family, and I became a civil servant, a high civil servant in France. And I did a couple of presidential campaigns, and I became a member of government in France. I became the Minister of Digital, Innovation and Small Businesses, then Minister for Foreign Trade, and then finally Minister for Culture and Communication between 2012 and 2016. And actually, when I was in charge of digital in France, something really struck me was that in France, when you travel around the world, France is always well known for its wine, for its cheese, for its luxury goods, but never for its tech. And I found it was really a pity, because in France we have very good engineers, we have great creative talents, we have great founders, we have great companies, but all the time when you talk about France, it's always about heritage or old things from the past, and not about technology. So I really wanted to change the image, and I wanted the French ecosystem to be more proud of itself, to have more self-esteem, and to be able to project a more positive image abroad. So I really started working on the ecosystem, the French ecosystem, and there were many difficulties that we have to face in France, and I think probably many difficulties that are the same in other countries in Europe, and probably in Southeast Asia. And one of these issues, for example, is the financing of startups. So why don't we have startups in Europe that can compete with the big giants of the US or in China, for example? Why don't we have companies that can beat Google, that can beat Apple, that can beat Facebook? And probably there are many, of course, many different kind of answers. But some of these answers are the following. First, it's difficult to find capital, or at least it was difficult to find capital in Europe. And when you compare the available capital for startups in Europe and in the United States, it's a 1-to-8 ratio. So when you have $1 available in Europe, it will be $8 in the United States. So that's the first problem, the problem of financing. And this problem is even bigger when you look at the companies that are growing, that are scaling. So there's a lot of money for seed rounds in Europe, but there's not much money for larger rounds. That's the first problem. A second problem is probably the mindset also, because in Europe or in France, we have a difficulty to, how could I say, we have a difficulty with failure. Failure is not in our culture. And it's very difficult for somebody who has run a business, but the business has failed, to have a second chance. And that's probably in the way we're educated in the business culture. It's difficult to have failed and then to have a chance to rebound. Whereas, for example, if you go to the Silicon Valley, and some of you might have had this experience, if you go to an American VC fund and you're a founder, they will ask you how many times you've failed before. And if you have failed before, it will not be a hurdle for them to give you money. So that's the mindset. Entrepreneurial mindset was also probably lacking ambition in Europe, and we probably had a problem with failure. Then there were other issues, like the fact that exits are very complicated in Europe because there are not so many big companies, big corporations that can put billions on the table to acquire a company that is growing. Whereas, of course, when you're in the United States or in Japan or in China, you have these big companies with deep pockets who can help exit. And of course, when you're an investor, it's difficult to invest in companies when you don't have a perspective of a good exit. So there were many different kinds of issues that I identified, and I tried working on when I was in government. And so I worked, for example, on the crowdfunding regulation in order to help the small segment of financing industry. I worked on consolidating the VC industry. I helped creating a large venture fund in the public bank for investment in France. So I try to work on different aspects of financing. I try to work on the culture of failure, introducing falcons in France, which was really not in the French culture. But I wanted students or young people to have access to people who are very successful, and to have access to the story of these successful people. And these people explained how many times they had failed before being successful. And it was very important that young people, felt disinhibited towards failure. Then I worked also on the projection of the French tech ecosystem abroad. I really said to the ecosystem, you should gather, you should be a force, we should have a common branding, a common baseline. And so we created the label French Tech, and then we started going to international venues like the CES in Las Vegas, and there were like hundreds of French companies going together as a very strong delegation. And then we started to have very good communication and very good press in the international media, especially the Anglo-Saxon media, who are not really nice to the French business ecosystem. So all these actions started to put the focus on the French tech ecosystem. And whenever I travel now to Taiwan, to other parts of the world, and when they tell me, well, French tech, how did you do the French tech movement? It's very successful. We know about French tech now. I think it shows that of course, we didn't create the French tech ecosystem, but we gave him more visibility and more self-esteem. And that was something that was probably very important. So after doing that, and of course I make a long story short, but after doing that, and I was out of government, I asked myself, how could I, in the private sector, how could I continue to do to have the same kind of ambition, the same kind of vision? How could I do that from an investor perspective? Why did I want to do that? It's because I think that in Europe and in Asia, we can probably combine our forces and our strengths to build bigger multi-local champions, multi-regional champions, because it's going to be very difficult for us in the years to come on a standalone basis to build very powerful corporations, very big companies that can compete with the GAFAs, the Google, Apple, Facebook, or the Baidu, the Alibaba, the Tencents. But maybe if we combine our forces, maybe then we will be more strong and more able to compete with these big players. And so I think it's not a question of a new battle between regions of the world, between Europe against the United States or Asia against China. It's just because I believe that in a world that is multipolar today, we need to have a level playing field. We cannot be totally dominated by one or two countries that accumulate the wealth, the know-how, the talents, that can attract the brains. And it's really a question of probably sustainable relationships between countries, of protecting also our values, our democracy, our sovereignty. It's not a protective strategy, but it's something that has to do with keeping a balance in the economic powers of the country. So I think it's really important that we should really try to build these regional champions. And I shared this conviction with a company, the founder of a company who became my investor in the venture capital fund I created. So the founder is the founder of Naver. So some of you here might know the company. Naver is the #1 internet portal and search engine in South Korea. And they've also created Line, which probably also you know, which is a messenger service here in Asia. And the founder of this company was totally sharing this vision that we should collaborate to create very big champions that can compete with the big giants. And so together we decided to create a venture capital fund in order to identify potential European champions in Europe and combine their forces, their strengths, with Asian capital, with Asian markets, with Asian business access. And so what we're trying to do now is to invest in companies that we feel have the potential to become regional champions and help them grow in Asia, in South Korea, but also in Japan, in Singapore, in all the region. And what we're trying to achieve with that is to build effectively this bridge between Europe and Asia, and to try to create a new kind of a multi-regional champion that will tomorrow, we think, be a credible competitor to the big internet giants. And why I think this is important is because Slush was also an event that was created in Europe, in Northern Europe. I visited Slush in Helsinki a couple of times. And I think the fact that Slush is having this session here in Asia shows that we have probably, we share this interest in building bridges between our two regions. And I think we definitely should make our best efforts. It's not very easy because we don't have the same culture, we don't have the same languages, we don't have the same ways to consume, to access to knowledge, to access to culture. But we should resolutely try to find ways to create these bridges and make them a force and a strength for our two regions. Because I think it's probably the only way we can make it, we can compete in this very competitive world that we're entering. And when we're looking at the way artificial intelligence, automation, machine learning, etc., are going to transform our economies, I think it's very important that we should definitely try to bridge this gap and combine our forces between Europe and Asia. So we're not very, there's not many people, so maybe I'm open to answer questions if you have some, because I think it's more interactive than having me speaking in front of you. I'm not sure I can hear you if you have any questions, but I'd be happy to answer any question you might have, either on my experience as a member of government or as an investor now in a venture capital fund.
Which countries in Asia look most attractive to you as for investment? Which countries most?
So for now, the fund that I created is Korelya Capital, called Korelya Capital. It's based out of Paris, and it has 200 million euros to invest. But we invest now only in Europe. But we invest in Europe only in companies that have an interest in the Asian markets, because our value proposition is to help them develop in the Asian markets. That's for the first fund. But we'll probably raise a second fund in later this year, and probably the outreach of the investment vehicle will be wider, probably worldwide. But why did we limit it to Europe for the first fund? Is that we want to be very hands-on investors, so we not just put some capital, not just inject some money, but we really want to involve ourselves in the management of the company, if the managers want to, if the founders agree to it. We really want to help them develop and grow their business in Asia. So, and you can do that only when you're relatively close to the founders. So that's why we're limited to Europe right now. Sorry, you have to come to the front because otherwise.
Good afternoon. Thanks for your talk. My question relates to any sensitivities in the technology that, for example, in the US now, they are prohibiting certain high-tech companies from cross-licensing or using it in China, for example, other areas. And as an investor, does this kind of constraints come into your fund or not from political considerations?
So no constraints for me yet, but it is true that there is a very ambiguous relationship between Europe and China. It's not really all the countries of Asia, it's mainly China, especially in sensitive infrastructure, in the telecom business, for example. Of course, there are some issues with the infrastructure, the networks, etc., towards the Chinese manufacturers. Probably in cybersecurity also, or in everything that is a sensitive economic vertical. But as for now, we didn't feel any constraints as investors. We would probably have some if we had some startup or portfolio company that was exporting sensitive technologies. So that could happen. But we started investing in January 17, and until now we never had this case. But it is an issue, definitely. Okay, so thank you all for coming today.